Today I had a really fun conversation with Greg Fitzsimmons. He is a friend of Tom O'Neill, who I interviewed a couple months back. They've known each other for decades, and Tom put us in contact, said we would really get along and that I should have him on the show, so thought it would be really fun, and we did have a really nice conversation. Greg is a really accomplished stand-up comedian, and he's a 4-time Emmy-winning writer, and he's been a host on different TV shows, radio, and he's had his own podcast for many years, FitzDog Radio podcast. He also has one called Sunday Papers. His most recent special was filmed at the Mothership about a year ago, and it's hilarious. I highly recommend you check that out. He's a really good comedian, and he's found his way through the industry and stayed healthy through it all. We get into some of his philosophy and his daily habits in this conversation. He's made over 20 visits to the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's had 50 visits to the Howard Stern Show and over 100 visits on the Adam Carolla Show. He's done so many different things. He's had different appearances on The Tonight Show, Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Kimmel, David Letterman, and he's just a really interesting guy that's kept a balance and found his way through the world of comedy and entertainment and kept himself healthy through the whole process. He's got a couple kids, and we get more into his daily practices, his daily habits, and who he is as a human being. It was a really fun conversation, and I believe he's going to be here in Arizona at the Tempe Improv November 22nd through the 24th, so get your tickets for that. And go to his website, gregfitzsimmons.com, and all of that will be in the show notes. Enjoy the episode.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Well, what's up, Greg? Thanks for joining me, brother.
Ryan, I hear tremendous things about you. My friend Tom O'Neill had a really nice time hanging out with you.
Nice. That's good to hear. I was wondering how we connected. I knew it was through Tom, but I was wondering how you knew him.
Tom has been my neighbor for 30 years or so. We were neighbors in New York. We lived in Little Italy on Mulberry Street on the 6th floor of a walk-up, an old tenement building that was all it was all these old Italian ladies that had like grown up in the building, and they were real characters. And so we would walk up 6 flights of stairs, but everybody had their doors open because it was hot. It was an old tenement, so it was stuffy. And also they wanted to know what was going on. And so you'd have to say, hey, Vinny girl, hey, Gina. And then a lot of times they'd have they were used to cooking for a family. So they always made too much. They give you a plate of pasta. So we always ate well. And then the intercom didn't work. So you couldn't buzz people in. So people would call you, and then you'd have a sock. And Tom was on the street side. So I would have to go to Tom's apartment and take my keys and a sock and throw them 6 floors down so people could let themselves in. And then we moved out to LA at the same time, and we moved in about 3 houses from each other in Venice Beach.
Nice. Did you guys plan that to be close to each other because you became buddies? Nice. Yeah. Cool. That's awesome, dude. Yeah, he's so cool. That was the first time I met him, actually, but I dove deep into his book in 2020 and then got obsessed with his work, and he's just such a cool dude. So I had a great time, and then he mentioned you, and so it's cool to meet you virtually. Great. This is like a first date online. This is a true online date.
Yeah, it is. I know you're a little nervous, but you're excited.
Yeah. So I did a little research on you. I'd already heard your special. It was fucking great. So that was cool.
Thank you.
Your most recent one. I've never actually heard your older one, the one that got you pretty famous on the map.
Yeah, this one, I feel like this is the best one I've ever done. It's, I felt the most in control of the material, and I thought the venue was a good fit for me. Like my special before that I did in it was like a 1,700 seat theater, which I'm not used to playing. I'm used to playing clubs. And so when I taped the special, I did it at Joe Rogan's club, which holds about maybe 400 people, but it's really lit and set up. he made it so he wanted people to shoot specials there. So I'm the second person to shoot a special there. And I just felt like I was in the pocket. I felt really comfortable, and I brought in a really good production company, so I thought it looked good.
Dude, it sounded good, and I actually had my mother up visiting yesterday, and we drove up north on a little road trip together, and I told her about you, and I said, yeah, I'm going to be chatting with him tomorrow, because I'm new to this game. I'm only 25 episodes in, but
Uh-huh.
so we threw you on the way home, and she's laughing her ass off, and she's like, I can't believe how good he is, and then I showed her
Oh,
your bio.
nice.
Your bio is pretty dense, man. Like for a comedian, it's a hard industry, and I'd love to get into a little bit of that.
Yeah, well,
Just like you made it, you know?
well, it's funny. It's been a 35-year trickle. Like I always joke that I crawl my way to the middle and I'm staying right there. It's kind of, there's always times where I get, people get jealous and you can start to covet, people that are doing better than you. But I would say when I look back on it, I'm extremely fortunate to have been, actively working for this many years, and also not to have gotten so famous that I can't walk down the street, or, people are coming to you. Oh, you do this project. Hey, will you do my show? Hey, can I borrow some money? Like, I'm not that guy. Nobody's like bothering me for selfies. I get asked, every couple days, somebody will stop me on the street, which is nice. But, I open up for Bert Kreischer sometimes on the road, and like, you literally cannot walk 10 feet down the street without a crowd forming. It's like, who wants to lose that much of their life,
Dude, anonymity seems like a gift. Like, I always think fame seems so cool when you're younger, and then I'd imagine
Yeah.
it's probably one of the greatest curses.
I think it's a real handcuff that you're in. And, I think that the thing I'm proudest of in my life is that I really struck a balance. We just celebrated our 25th year of marriage. I just made out with her in the kitchen, which you don't
Nice.
usually do after 25 years. And, my kids are 21 and 23, and they love being around us. We go out to dinner, we hang out, we have deep talks. I have good friendships that I've had for, 20, 30 years that are neighbors that live near me. So I'm having a lot of gratitude right now in my life. And, if I can squeeze another 5 years out of this career, great. And then I can very easily just say, I've been doing this since I was 20 years old, working hard, and I deserve a slightly early retirement. I think 61, 62, and bow out.
That's amazing. And it's probably in your industry, I imagine it's freaking, especially you live in LA. I was curious about this because I don't know your industry well, but I've listened to plenty of podcasts with comedians and different folks over the years. I'm a big podcast junkie, but it's like, dude, you live in the heart of people losing their soul.
Yeah.
And just not, they're good people, but they get swept into the momentum of what they're chasing. And it seems like you do have a good balance. And at the end of the day, that's a little bit of wisdom over the years to realize what's important, your family, your health, the fact that you found balance. I mean, I'm curious how you started to discover that. And like in the beginning, I'm sure it was quite rough because you're trying to get in and trying to survive and pay your bills. So
yeah, I think people go like, how do you stay married for 25 years? And I always say, well, first find Erin Covell and marry her. Like, I found a woman that understood my career and the demands of it and was very supportive about it. And when we had kids, she was a stay-at-home mom for 18 years. And I traveled a lot. And, I tried to show up as much as I could when I was home. But she really never gave me resentment about having to kind of shoulder a lot of the responsibility with the kids. So, you don't get that with every partner. Yeah, I mean, a lot of partners... I think people have problems in their marriage, and because they have a couple issues with each other, and instead of accepting them and allowing that this person has a shortcoming, in my case, my shortcoming is just that I'm not around. They just keep banging their head against the wall, and I think it's about, there's things about her that I get frustrated with, and you just accept it and you try to be grateful for the good stuff.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, I don't know too many people. I have a couple friends that have been married more than 10 to 15 years, and it's rare. And when you find that, because I'm a single guy at 43 with no kids, different world than you, of course, but I respect it when people dig in deep and go for the deeper well and work together through the hard times. And those folks that are very few and far between that do make it, it's like they've learned what you just said. It's like learning how to have some compassion and some acceptance and patience and let go of the bullshit and
Yeah.
accept them for who they are and grow together. I'm sure you've went through some trials and tribulations over the years,
Yeah,
especially being kids when you met, really.
Yeah, well, no, we were 30 when we met. So we'd already I used to have a joke, like we'd both been in so many relationships before we met that when we came up for pet names for each other, we'd already used all the good ones. And by the end, I was Norman and she was Dude.
That's awesome.
So, no, but there was times like, the first year that my son was born, I was on the road a lot. I freaked out and I was like, I got to make money. I got to pay for college. And so I just took every road gig I could take. And then my wife was like having a nervous breakdown. She's like, you can't keep doing this. And so I called up Louis C.K., who's a very dear friend, and he was writing on a TV show called Cedric the Entertainer Presents. It was a sketch show on Fox. And I said, hey, man, I got to get off the road. And he goes, let me talk to Cedric. Calls me right back. He goes, come in on Monday. You meet with Cedric. They're looking for a monologue writer. So think of some ideas for Cedric's monologues. And meanwhile, it's like, I'm this white guy from New York and he's this black guy from St. Louis. Like, I don't really have a lot in common with Cedric. So I just wrote really hard that weekend. I just tried to come up with premises for him. And I sat down with him and I pitched him one idea that I pitched him that we did on the show that week. And this is when reality shows were brand new, like Survivor and all the shows were brand new. And I said, it's always the black guy that gets kicked off first. He could be like a Navy SEAL. He was an Eagle Scout. He's the nicest guy, but like, don't let the tent flap hit you on the way out. And so I got hired on that show. And so that was my concession was, all right, I'll write for TV as well as stand up, because then when I'm on a show, I'm not on the road. So I wrote on Cedric for a couple of years, and then I wrote on Louis. Louis had a sitcom I wrote on for a couple of years. And then I wrote on Bill Maher's show. I wrote for Ellen for 2 years. I wrote for Wanda Sykes for a year. I wrote for Jamie Foxx for a year. I wrote for a lot of black shows. That became my niche for some reason, is I would just get offered black shows. It's like Hollywood sees what you've done, and then they go, oh, he's that guy. So because Cedric was my first job, it just became, I was a white guy that wrote for black people.
That's interesting. Before you were writing for shows and you were writing for comedy, did you ever see yourself doing something like that? Or had you had that in your forecast of what you wanted to do?
Well, yeah, I was an English major in college and I wanted to be a writer. And my father wasn't around for much of my career. He died when I'd only been doing stand-up for a couple of years. But he said to me, keep writing, because if you write, you'll always stay relevant in the business. He was very prescient about that, because stand-up comedy was not a very developed entertainment form at that point. There weren't a million stand-up clubs when I started. And it was really amazing advice. He told me to keep writing. And so, yeah, and when I was in high school, I wrote a variety show for the cable access. I used to write sketches and we'd shoot them for cable access. So, yeah, I think that was always going to be part of the picture.
Nice. That's pretty cool. And what's your writing process like? Is it late night? Is it morning? Do you have rituals? Everyone's so different in their creative process.
Well, I have ADD, so I really struggle with doing things in a regular, normalized, disciplined way. But I have a notepad on my phone, and when I think of ideas, I say them into the phone, and then I'll work on stuff. But I have a podcast with my friend Mike Gibbons called Sunday Papers, and it's a very written podcast because we go through the week's news as if it's a newspaper. We do sports, entertainment, business, and we do the top stories from the week. And we write hard jokes on the topics. So usually I'll like sort of like pull stories from the newspaper during the week, and then on Thursday and Friday we record on Friday. So like Thursday and Friday morning, I'll sit down, take some Ritalin, and just crank out jokes. And if I have deadlines, I'm really good. Like I can get hyper focused, and I love writing. When I get into a groove, it makes me feel powerful. You know, it
Dude,
makes
I
me
love that.
Yeah, it makes me feel confident and powerful.
And I love how against the grain that is from what you're taught in school, which we can get into some of your book. It seems like the thesis is to be a rebel and to be counter matrix, right? And you're always punished for it and everybody's trying to contain you. But the best artists seem to be the ones that break the rules, you know, like Rick Rubin talks about. It's like the creative process doesn't look like anything. It's you tapping into your fucking creativity and the way that you do it. And yours is to get crunch time. It sounds like I can't imagine writing jokes the morning of for a podcast, but that's where you flow. It sounds like that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I was like that in school. And I think it's, you know, with ADD, what Ritalin or Adderall does is it spikes your adrenaline, and it makes you, I think with ADD, we have a lower resting place. Just neurologically, we're down lower. And then the stimulants bring our brains up where they get in sync with us emotionally, and then you can actually engage and do things. So it's harder when I'm doing a project on my own. Like if I'm trying to write a script on my own with no deadline, it's nearly impossible. So, you know, I've used a lot of techniques about setting, you know, small deadlines, write an outline by Friday, you know, get a beat sheet the week after that, write a sloppy first draft the week after that, you know, and like actually set deadlines, and then I kind of stick to them, but I have to step it out very specifically, and then it'll work. I can't look at I can't look at the mountain, or I can't do it.
That's cool. I love to hear people's creative process and how they do what they do, because most people need to hear it, older and younger, especially kids, because when we're in the matrix as a kid, you're being bombarded with so much, like it's got to be this and it better be this, and you're like openly talking about like, hey, I took the drug, which I'm pro, do whatever you got to do. Caffeine's a drug. Drugs are awesome. That's what makes creativity. You don't want to throw them away. Like Bill Hicks used to say, like, if you don't believe that drugs are good, throw it all in the trash and burn all your records, all your albums, because it's, all the musicians and artists were real fucking high on drugs.
Yeah,
but
it's like, not if you don't believe in drugs, listen to this.
Rad. Yeah, I love Bill Hicks. I wish he didn't die so young, because it's like, dude, imagine what we'd be hearing if he was 65 ripping it. Guy was like 14.
He was a huge influence. I started in Boston, and he was a huge influence on a lot of the Boston comics. And then me and Joe Rogan, we started at the same week together, and we traveled for years together. And Bill Hicks came to town, and he was our favorite. And he came to town, and we got to sit in the room and watch him do a couple sets, and hung out with him in the green room a little bit. It was a big deal.
Dang, that's amazing. Not many people on the planet got to do that.
Yeah.
How old were you when you started?
I was in college, so I was like, 21 or so.
Nice. And you already knew way before that, though, that you were going to dip into comedy when you were in high school?
Well, I never thought I would do it for a living. I always just was obsessed with comedy. Like when I was a kid, we used to go into all the clubs in New York City. We'd go to the Catch Rising Star and the Comedy Cellar, and me and my friend Frank Moretti were obsessed. And I collected comedy albums. I memorized comedy albums. I read every Mad magazine that ever came out. I mean, when I was a little kid, like even comic books, I was like obsessed with anything funny. I like the math of jokes. I like to think about how a joke turned and revealed itself, and the timing of it. And I was just very into stand up. And then when I was in high school, I did it at a talent show senior year. I did a bit of cocaine and got on stage, and it was the biggest high of my life. And I kind of knew that I wanted to keep trying to do it. And so I did it at some talent shows, even like freshman year of college. I think so. Really, I started probably when I was more like 19. And, but then I really started going out to the club senior year. I would go to class during the day, and then every night I would be at open mic nights, and then later getting actual paid gigs. And so by the time I graduated, there was so much comedy in New England that I was very fortunate. I feel bad for comedians today because there's so many people trying to break in. It's so hard to make it. And when I started, if you had 15 minutes and a car, you could actually, I was making a living when I graduated college. I've never had a job. I've just done this.
That's a crazy difference. Like, is it because of podcasts and the internet when it shifted in like '09, smartphones and Joe Rogan and podcasts that shifted comedy? Or where did that paradigm change? Because I remember it being pretty rare too to even know that Joe Rogan didn't exist in my consciousness other than Fear Factor. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden he's selling out arenas. But I was listening. I got obsessed with podcasts right when smartphones came out. I just started going, holy shit, we can learn from people and listen to their, that was cool. And it still is cool. I think it's the coolest thing on the planet, which is why we're here. I get to talk to some cool dude from across the way. But when did comedy take that paradigm shift, or how the hell did that work in your eyes?
Yeah, there was definitely like the comedy boom that was going on when I first started ended. Like if I started in '89, then the boom probably ended in like the mid '90s, and things were bad for a while. And then podcasts came along, which would have been in probably 2010 or so. 2008 was when they really started. And then it started to draw this more of a cult of personality where people were coming to the shows and you didn't have to give them the premise. You didn't have to walk out and go, I'm really into like the moon landings, or, hey, I got a wife and 2 kids. Like they know you. They already know you, and they buy into you. And so now there's this connection you have with the crowd, not the whole crowd, but enough of the crowd where I think people felt more comfortable, and it started to blur the line between the podcast and the stand-up. And, I think one informed the other. Like if I go on the road for a weekend, like I record my podcast, my other podcast, FitzDog Radio, which I do like a 15-minute intro for. That's all stuff that happened in the clubs that weekend. I was just in Kansas City this weekend. And if I've got some material that I thought of on stage, that I do that in the podcast. And then conversely, something will happen in the podcast and I'll say, oh, that's kind of a bit, and I'll bring that on stage.
That's amazing. It's such a completely different thing that nobody could have seen before podcasts. Because I remember going to see Bert Kreischer back in the day. I think he had made his first appearance on Joe Rogan, and he told the machine story for the first time to a broad audience, to the world, really.
Yeah.
And I didn't know who Bert was, to be honest. I don't think I knew of him very much as a comedian guy that's who he is now. But that fucking machine story, the first time I heard it, I was crying, laughing, and just belly laughing, like he's doing it. What the hell? And he went to first of all, his shirt sold out online. I went to buy one. I'm like, I'm going to buy the Machines shirt. It was sold. Yeah. And you start seeing that with even authors like Graham Hancock, who they're sort of nobodies, and it's like all of a sudden you can't get a book from them, and you can't go to, it's incredibly different now. And I think it's awesome.
Well, when you think about the numbers, a typical late night show like Jimmy Kimmel, if he gets 400,000 viewers in a night, that's a good rating for them. And then these big podcasts are getting millions per episode. And it's not just, and if you're going on that podcast, like if I go on the Tonight Show, I'm going to go on, the show starts at 11:30. I'll be act 7. So I'll go on at 12:20. Nobody's watching. And there's always, so you go on and you're only going on for 5 minutes, and you're doing this sanitized version of your act because the producer will pick through it and pick through it and take out anything edgy. And so that's your exposure. That's what we used to do to get big as comedians. That was the holy grail, was getting on late night TV. And now you get on a podcast where people can listen to it anytime they want. You're on for an hour to 3 hours. And it's just, it's like mainlining the comedian or the author or, even actor. Look at the fucking presidents. Kamala Harris and Trump are both fighting to get on Rogan right now.
It's wild, dude.
Yeah.
We live in the coolest time ever, I think, as far as how weird it is.
Yeah.
What your book looked like? It was written in like 2011, right?
I don't even remember.
I think I just looked at you this morning as far as like, I don't know your whole track record. I never read your book, but I was like, damn, that was a long time ago. What drove you to write that, and how did that go? Was that just a hell of a task to try to write a book and get it published? And especially back then, that was before Amazon and all the stuff was available.
Yeah, well, I got approached I used to do the Howard Stern show a lot. I used to go on there like every few months for like 10 years. And so this agent approached me and he said, you've got a really big platform here. I think you have a lot of people that would be interested in reading a book by you. And so why don't you come up with a proposal and we'll see if we can sell it to one of the publishers. So I had thought, like, I had recently found this box in my aunt's basement in the Bronx, and it had all these report cards in it from when I was a kid. And then it had all these letters from teachers about misbehavior. And it had police reports from when I'd been arrested. It was like the Hall of Fame of everything I'd ever done wrong. And my mother saved all of it. Because when you're Irish, it's like their parents think it's funny when you fuck up. Because we're like rebels and we're supposed to do the opposite of what we're told to do. It's like what you're talking about before. And so I looked at that and I said, what if each of these is a chapter of the book and I go into what happened when I got arrested this time, or what happened when I got kicked out of school that time. And so I called the book Dear Mrs. Fitzsimmons, Tales of Redemption from an Irish Mailbox. And I put together a proposal, and we pitched it to some publishers, and we had a bidding war. We had 3 different publishers that wanted to do it. And so we went with Simon & Schuster, and then I had to write it. And at the time, I was writing on a TV show. I was writing on Wanda Sykes' show, and I had a development deal with ABC, so I had a script that I owed them. Damn. And I was going on the road on the weekends, and I was doing a podcast, and I had 2 young kids. And I think I might have had a nervous breakdown, or very close. I was really, really out of my mind. Like I didn't know who I was anymore. And so I quit the job. I quit the writing job. I canceled a bunch of my road work, went to a shrink. I got on medication, and I calmed down. And I got this office near my house. And I used to go to the office, and I would procrastinate. Because I didn't have hard deadlines. Right. And so I would just keep procrastinating. And like, I would stay at that office all day and all night. I remember I used to come home in time to make my kids breakfast and take them to school. And then I would come home and I would sleep. And then I would go do it all over again. And I would never write another book. That was brutal. Because there was no deadlines. TV shows I can write no problem, because every day at 11 o'clock is the first wave of jokes, and then you rewrite until 5 o'clock when you tape, and then you're done.
It's funny because a lot of artists would look at it the other way. A different person would go, you know what? The deadlines are the reason I can't write a book. Yeah. And for you, you need that pressure, and that's how you thrive, and you just pop the Adderall and get grinding. But I know a lot of people that would say, man, fuck writing a book because the deadline limits my capacity to whatever. And I'm wondering, did your book go through the roof more after, like later down the road because of your podcast and your following, and then people started buying the book, or did it sell more then before all that took off?
I don't even know. I mean, I know it did well because they went to paperback with it, but I never really tracked it until a few years ago. I said to my agent, I go, hey, how come we never got more money on this book? Like, and so he audited them, and we got the paperwork, and they're such criminals, these publishers. They claim all these costs, all this overhead. Like literally, they say every month they spend $1,500 on publicity for me. And I'd say like, all right, show me one thing you've done in the last 10, literally one thing, one tweet you've sent out about my book. But it's just criminal. They just charge you all this overhead so that whatever you make, it never offsets what they say their costs are.
That's pretty crazy. So
Yeah,
now,
it is.
Yeah, that seems criminal for sure. I've always thought writing a book seemed like the hardest thing to maybe do as a human being, but then some people crank out 20 of them. You know?
I know.
I guess it's just the
well.
look
How long it took Tom O'Neill. 20 years.
Yeah, and you were with him that whole time, watching him go
day.
through. He probably was going through hell because it kept going further and further. That was my favorite interview because I was like, dude, you had to geek out so hard on this and not even wanting to at first.
Yeah, well, I mean, for him, it was like, as a journalist, I mean, he's an investigative reporter. And every time he would crack a new source or find a new lead or, try to get some new records out of that are sealed, like there were battles for him. He's very tenacious and he likes taking people on. And so each chapter of that book was a chapter of his life where he would get into this car. I gave him my car. He had no money. Wow. He literally was broke. He was like teaching English as a second language. He was driving Uber, and then his car died. So we gave him our car, and then that one died. And my friend Mike Gibbons gave him another car, and he would drive it into the desert. He would drive it up to Northern California. He would find these like LAPD officers that were on their deathbeds that were finally willing to talk about what really happened. And it was an adventure for 20 years. It wasn't like, he took 3 weeks off at a time, which is why it took so long. He was working the entire time.
Dude, you have the biggest front row seat to his life, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
As far as friendship goes, and like
I'm the only person he named in the book.
That's incredible. And like for you going along as a friend, like you guys probably pretty much love each other as brothers at this point, that many years. What was it like for you continuously in real time? Because you got way more than the book ever could fit in. Learning about the corruption of the CIA and MK Ultra and all that shit. What was it like for you to experience that back in the day, all the way through that 20 years?
I got scared for him a lot because, these were serious people. Bugliosi was a dangerous guy. He has assaulted people in the past. These were, CIA. You're talking LAPD. Like, he was revealing things that could seriously damage any of these organizations. And when he would go out of town, he would take all of his boxes of documents and he'd bring them over and put them in my daughter's closet.
Oh my God.
Because he was afraid they were going to break in and take them.
Wow.
So I was really worried about him a lot.
Yeah, that had to be somewhat scary for sure. Because even when I'm sitting there, I'm like, dude, how did you not ever get whacked? It'd be so easy to just be like, well, before he goes on Joe Rogan, let's just give him some lead poisoning,
Yeah, right.
But he didn't seem to have a lot of paranoia around it. But yeah, that's cool that you had a front row seat to that.
Yeah, no, he was worried all the time. He really was. And, it's the kind of reporting that you just don't see that much. There's so many books that are written by conspiracy theorists that just sit in their basement and they mine a bunch of existing stuff that's just in the dark web. But he's a real old school boots on the ground reporter. He went out and, really dug.
Yeah, and if he didn't go on Joe Rogan, I wonder if that book would have ever made it to where anyone would have heard of it. It's sad to say, but it's like that really leveraged his ideas to the degree that someone like me, and during COVID, I'm sort of pent up in the house going to work every third day as a fireman. But as soon as I saw that, I already was deep into MK Ultra, but not to the degree that Tom obviously went. And I was like,
well, he went places nobody had ever gone before. With
no one had done it.
And I think the Rogan audience was a really good match because Joe had talked about, it's a lot of deep state stuff that they get into and trying to pull back, the curtain on what's going on in the government that we don't learn about. And so I think he found a good audience there. And then luckily Rogan loved the book so much that he'll just bring it up over and over again. If he has a guest on, like he had Quentin Tarantino on, who is also a fan of the book, and they just like geeked out on it for like an hour. And then if Joe has a guest and the topic comes up, he'll like give a synopsis of the book and the sales will go up again. And then he's had a lot of other people that have championed the book, like other broadcasters that have dug it. So I think it's the kind of book that it's got serious momentum now. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for like 17 weeks now or something. And it's got its own life now. I think beyond any one podcast or whatever, I think that it's like, it's becoming part of the collective, knowledge of the country right now.
Yeah. And it's cool to see because it plants seeds in people that create something that you can't really measure. Because even me, I have had Dr. Jack Cruz on, who I actually sent Tom his podcast with Danny Jones. Danny Jones is somewhat of a conspiracy podcast. But this interview with Dr. Jack Cruz was 4 hours. I had to hear it twice. And then I had him on my podcast, I think 3 weeks before Danny had him on. But anyway, this dude's a neurosurgeon whose TED Talks were banned, and he's broken down a lot of the MK Ultra history, not to the degree that Tom has. They need to be in a room together, actually. And he even said he would love to meet Tom. But it's just like it leads me down the avenue of a rabbit hole. And my little microcosm of guests have already been shadow banned and blocked, and I couldn't post his video. And then I had Dr. Peter McCullough on last week. They removed my YouTube account. And now I'm like, dude, I'm a nobody. I'm just having fun out here. Yeah, I'm trying to have a good time, talk to interesting people, seek the truth.
Wait, you got banned from YouTube?
Not banned. They took his video down within 1 hour. And Dr. Peter McCullough, you know him. He's been on Rogan, and he talked about the vaccines. He's like the most published doctor in his field in history. And during COVID, he was promoting ivermectin and different things. And before we started the conversation, he goes, hey, if you want this to survive on YouTube, we're not going to say the China virus. You're not going to say what it is, where it came from. You're not going to say all these keywords. So we had to censor in real time, which I don't think I'll ever really do again because it's going to get removed anyway.
You just didn't do it on
COVID.
This podcast.
Yeah, well, it's fucked up because they got an algorithm now, and AI scrubs it for any word that's said. Even if you don't say it, it's weird. They know.
Wow.
And I never believed in that. But, Tom's work and all these other guys' work helps you to realize just how deep it goes and why it goes that way.
Yeah.
And it's fucked up. So that video can't be seen by anybody. And Jack Cruz's video gets 500 views versus some artist in Phoenix who nobody knows gets 3,500 views in 2 days. It's fucking crazy to me.
Right.
So anyway, it might have fucked up our ability to get your podcast out because in the last week, I think I'm in an algorithm that, people can't hear it anymore because it's... It's all right. I'll shift and adjust. I think you go on Rumble and a couple other platforms and you figure it out. But it's an interesting
Rumble?
subject.
That's a less censored platform.
I didn't really know much of it, but like Brett Weinstein and people that were on Rogan during 2020 that were talking about COVID had to move there because they were getting their demonetization process. And even Rogan had to get off YouTube and go to Spotify for him to actually then his first episode was Alex Jones. That was his first big banger.
God. Yeah.
But he couldn't have had that guy on during COVID because they would have scrubbed him and demonetized him and got rid of all his content.
Yeah.
So it's just a weird time to think about. But yeah, Tom somewhat helped push me in that direction a little more where I was like, yeah, I want to know a little bit more about this and talk to some of these folks,
Yeah.
So I'm curious who some of your mentors were in the comedy world.
Well, when I was a kid, when I was in high school, we had this program called, I think it was called Intercession. And during your senior year, they gave you 2 weeks off from school to pursue whatever it is you thought you were going to do for a living. And so I wanted to be a comedy writer. And so my dad put me in touch with a guy. My father was in radio growing up, and he was like one of the biggest radio guys in New York my whole life. And so he belonged to a place called the Friars Club, and it's like an entertainment club for people that are mostly comedians, but broadcasters. And so he was friends with a guy named Alan Zweibel, who was one of the original Saturday Night Live writers. He wrote Killer Bees and all the stuff that John Belushi did, the samurai stuff, and he was huge. And so my dad put me in touch with him. And so he really took me under his wing, and like I showed him all my writing, and he'd give me notes, and he brought me to a taping, and then he took me to a party at Gilda Radner's house, and I got to meet all the SNL people, and so that was really great. And then I had him on my podcast a few years ago. I hadn't talked to him in a lot of years, and he's still out doing stuff, so I had him on my podcast. It was really nice.
That's awesome.
And then there was a guy, Alan Kirschenbaum. Freddie Roman is his stage name, and he's a guy who was a Borscht Belt comedian back in the 50s, and he was a guy who was another big Friars Club man who used to take me to his shows because I wanted to be a comedian when I was a teenager, so he'd bring me to his shows, and then he sponsored me at the Friars Club when I moved to New York. And then when I moved to LA, he's like, "Oh, you gotta meet my son. He's a big comedy writer. He writes for sitcoms. His name is Alan Kirschenbaum." So I have coffee with Alan, and then Alan starts reading my scripts and giving me notes. And he would bring me in writers' rooms on comedy shows and all this stuff. And then he died. Freddie died. And then I went to a play here in LA. And I said to my wife, "Wow, that actress is really good." And I looked her name up in the playbill, and her name was Molly Kirschenbaum. And I said, "Kirschenbaum?" I go, "That's weird." And I remembered that Alan had a daughter, and I remember at his funeral, this like 15-year-old girl sang. And so I found her after the show, and I said, "You're not Alan Kirschenbaum's daughter?" And she goes, "Yeah, I am." And so I've taken her out. She came over to dinner at my house the other night with her partner. And I keep saying they are amazing, super talented. They wrote a short film and produced it. And so now I'm mentoring her. So that feels really good.
That's cool. Yeah, you get to sort of pass the torch. It seems like you appreciate and see those little synchronistic events that made you who you are, and you're like, I'm going to give back a little bit.
This feels like the time of my life where I really want to try to give back. I try to help younger comics. It's hard sometimes. You want to help them, but sometimes you just see that they're not helping themselves, that they're in it for the wrong reasons, or they're not treating it like a business. And it's just, like I said earlier, it's so competitive. You can't afford to not have your shit together. Like, you can't just be funny. You have to work social media. You have to make good videos. You have to write new material. You have to hang out at the clubs. Like, there's a lot. It's really hard to get traction.
Dude, I bet it's a grind. Did you deal with like addiction or any of the chaos in the beginning and any of that stuff like a lot of comics do? Because they're, a lot of them come from a dark place. Not all of them, but it's usually what makes a good comic.
Yeah, we have a lot of alcoholism in my family. My father was an alcoholic, and I'm an alcoholic, and so I quit about a year after I started stand-up. I realized that it was hurting me. It was hurting my career. It was hurting me personally and my growth emotionally. And so I stopped 34 years ago. I haven't had a drink in 34 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people need to hear that, because I'm sure at one point you were afraid that if you quit drinking and doing that thing that you were going to lose your creativity. Maybe you didn't feel that, but my friend Randy.
No, I never felt that. No.
Okay.
I felt just the opposite. I felt like it was dulling me. It was making me make bad choices in jokes. I was kind of being a bro comic, which wasn't really me. And so, I think it was time. I think that when people want to quit something, it's really important that you're replacing it with something else. If you have an addiction, it's great to find a career, something in your career that you're excited about. Maybe you get super into mountain biking. Maybe you want to restore cars. Maybe you want to, you have to replace it. And it can't be a relationship, because relationships end and then you're right back where you started again. You have to have something that builds a foundation in you that you can put that energy towards and get your mind off the addiction.
Yeah, that's huge advice, man, because addiction, it's not the substance or the behavior, it's the underlying thing that drives it. But if you transmute it into something like Randy, I talked to an artist the other day. He's really sort of a local famous artist that's made a living off of painting, which is pretty cool. And he said it was his 20-year anniversary of not drinking. And we got into some of that. And he's like, dude, if I didn't have art and fixing and geeking out on my VW bus vans and all the stuff that I'm obsessed with, I would have just never made it, and I would be screwed, And it's so cool to hear those stories, because a lot of people are suffering because humans suffer, which is the nature of addiction, but then they use the substance to just medicate temporarily, and they don't find the outlet to just shift it. And I'm like, yeah, it's just a superpower if you push it in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of addiction honestly comes from boredom and anxiety. And, when you have nothing to do and you're sitting around, it's just so much easier to be high and scroll your phone and just pass the time. And if you have anxiety, then even if you're only getting high at night, people go, oh, I don't have a problem. I just get high, and well, you're not dealing with your emotions during the day, because you're going, well, I'll get numb later and then I won't have to think about these, as opposed to having to go to bed at night whole, like finding a way to ground yourself before you go to bed without having to fuck up your head with a substance. And that requires mindfulness and meditation and exercise and, connecting with friends, journaling, like whatever it takes, like all those things, instead of just escaping every day.
Dude, that's amazing, especially for not, it's the culture at large, but I'm thinking for the people in the comedy world that maybe don't even know this about you. It's really good to hear that, because it's like this guy, in order to make it inside of an industry where it's revolved around drinking and momentum and chaos, you found a thread that's like, hey, no, I'm going to find balance in this. And I'd love to hear some of how you do that, like what your daily life is like. Because I think Tom brought up that you like breath work and things like that. And I'm like, dude, I found it as a first responder, seeing kids die early on and seeing chaos. And I saw the alcoholics and the marriages falling, and the culture was somewhat sick. Not all of it, but there was so much dis-ease. And I went, holy shit, I'm not going to make it early on if I don't figure out how to deal with this whole thing. And so thank God I did, and I found some tools. But I'm curious to hear, for other people to hear, what you do on a daily practice, and like what are some of your rituals, and how do you handle the road when it's busy? And
I mean, I have two lives. One is when I'm doing stand-up on the road, which is, maybe 25% of the time. And then the time when I'm home. When I'm home, it's a lot easier to control my environment. I can get up. I get up early, and I'll meditate, and then I'll have breakfast with my wife. We have a whole ritual where she sleeps later than me, so then I make her tea. I give her tea in bed, and then she makes oatmeal, and then we eat that, and I go off and do my day. But then I'll always work out right before I come home, because I feel like there's a transition between running around, being stressed out, taking care of activities, and then when I go to the gym, it lets me just burn it all out. And then when I walk in the door, I'm kind of present, and my chemicals are flowing. I'm in a good space. And then we'll have dinner, watch some TV. And then I'll usually, like maybe half the nights that I'm in town, I'll go out and do stand up. So that's kind of my routine. But gym and meditation are huge for me. And then when I'm on the road, I'll meditate on the flight. And then when I get in, I'll always try to fly in early enough that I can work out before my show that night. I don't hang out after the show. I just go back to my hotel room. I don't drink. I'm monogamous. Like, there's no reason for me to go out to bars after the show. I get invited all the time, and I'm just like, I just don't do it. If I have friends in town, I don't eat with them before the show. I used to do that, and it used to stress me out and fuck me up, and I'd have bad shows. I need to get in my own headspace before I go on. And yeah, I mean, what else do I do? I don't get out enough. Like, I'm starting to do more. I had this experience a few weeks ago with my wife. We were walking through Marina del Rey looking at all the boats. And then there was this setup. There was a bunch of bongo drums and maracas and tambourines. And there was like 3 or 4 old hippies sitting there. And they're like, hey, we're starting a drum circle. You guys want to come play a bongo or something? And I said to my wife, do you want to go do that? And she's like, nah. And I was like, and I just went, all right. And we kept walking. And for the rest of the day, I kept thinking to myself, I didn't play the fucking bongos. I should have played the bongos. And that's become my mantra for the last few weeks. And now when people ask me to do things like, in the last week, I went to a Dodgers game. I went to a Clippers game. I played golf. I went on a walk with whenever somebody asks me to do something, I just say yes. And I realized that when I'm on the road, I need to get out of the hotel during the day and go see something. Like when I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma the next week, and I went out and I went to this famous recording studio. I went to the Bob Dylan Museum, and I just felt it gave me. I'm always afraid I got to conserve my energy, but when I do an activity on the road, it actually gives me energy.
That's really cool. And it's one of those things where it's like, we're going to be dead soon. I say that all the time.
Yeah. Right.
And so while we're here, we're sort of, inside of this strange environment where there's infinite things to see and to experience. The bongo, like the drum circles. I don't know if you've ever done one, but I hopped in one in Venice Beach.
Oh, you did the drum circle in Venice?
Yeah. And I didn't know what I was doing, but you just hop in and they give you a bongo or a drum or whatever. I've done them before too, but I did one there where you're talking about, and it's freaking cool because there becomes this primal, it's the first instrument.
Yeah.
And it taps into something. And all of a sudden everyone's just having fun. There's no judgment. You're not a musician. You're just in a rhythm. And then there's a vibration to it. You're high in a way. You're buzzing. It's so cool. So now you're like, I didn't play the bongos as a quote for your life.
Yeah.
Know, and it's like, dude, that's an important message because life is over now. Like we don't know when we're going away. And so have fun, explore. Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, and Tom is always a guy that will call you up on a Sunday at 3 p.m, and he'll be like, he goes out and he has this sippy cup with a straw in it, and he makes a strong drink, and then he'll walk around Venice Beach and he'll just interact with, homeless people and tourists and, like bunch of guys that are playing hip hop, and like he's not intimidated by anybody, and he'll just start, and he'll make these videos, and we have this text chain, and he'll send it to everybody, and so he'll call you and be like, hey man, let's go to Hanano and get a burger and shoot some pool and walk around. And so I'm trying to do that more. He's got a nephew that's got a boat, and we'll cruise around the marina at night. He's always doing something interesting.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that creates an interesting story. Like, he just seems like quite an interesting man. So do you. Everyone is. If you start to dig in, you realize every human being has such a crazy world.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's cool. I'm curious what your thoughts are on psychedelics and drug use and your personal use and float tanks, because you have Venice, you have Crash out there.
I haven't been to that one, but I love float tanks. I think they're amazing. You can't stay in too long. Like I made the mistake of staying in for like an hour before I had a show that night, and I was completely discombobulated on stage. But like a good 20-minute float is really great, especially if you're somebody that's got a good meditation practice. It's a perfect place to meditate. But I took mushrooms on Sunday with my wife, and we just went out to this golf course that has like a big outdoor restaurant patio. And it's where a lot of my friends hang out. And so we watched the baseball game, putted. We had like a putting contest for like 2 hours, and it was good. It was a nice ride. But I'll do mushrooms like every 2 or 3 months. Not too heavy of a dose, like medium-sized dose. I did smoke pot for about 15 years, not a lot. I would take a micro dose before I went to sleep at night and then smoke it once in a while. But I stopped that about 9 months ago because I just realized it just made me groggy in the morning and I realized I didn't need it. So that's it. Really, it's just mushrooms once in a while.
Cool. Yeah, I was curious about that. I know your time is limited here, and I'm trying to be respectful of it, but I'm curious. I ask everyone, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
Jeez. Wow. I was going to die today. What do I want to share with the world? Like a personal secret?
Just like this might be your last time being heard on a podcast, and you literally are going to die right after you walk out of this podcast. It's a tough question, but it digs you a little deeper about what actually matters. It's a triage question of like what really matters.
I guess deal with your fear. I feel like I would have had a much fuller life if I had come to grips with my fear more. And I know where I got it. I got it from childhood stuff. And it's stuff that I've gone to therapy for. I've tried to meet it head on as much as possible. And I think I have worked through a lot of it. But I think for me personally, and like when I take mushrooms, I have clarity on that. I see it. And I think fear is crippling, and I think it keeps you from living your fullest life. So get to the root of it. Find out where your fear. Everybody has it, but try to figure out where it's coming from, and try to be cognitive about, like challenge your thoughts and realize that your thoughts aren't your reality, and that if you think this never happens for me or this always happens, stop and write down the times it has happened for you and say, all right, so this is fear. This is fear gripping you and keeping you from acting and being present. Because being present is scary. It's vulnerable. And I think the more you can take that fear on, the more you're going to have an ability to live a full life.
Man, I love that because fear, it seems like it's probably the foundation of what keeps people trapped as a prison. And I think on Tim Ferriss's podcast years ago, he said instead of January 1st, New Year's resolutions and goals, do fear setting instead of goal setting. And I remember that because I was writing down my fears, and it's funny because when you start to do that, you realize that's what somewhat gives you the internal freedom to liberate you from the thing that's keeping you at dis-ease. You're not free.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you're willing to share, you don't have to, but what are some of those fears, or what is the big one that seems to be your hang up? Because you seem pretty, you've done some work on your fear. Yeah, so it's not like you're just stuck in it.
Ever since I was a teenager, I think my mother had a real poverty mentality. But all four of my grandparents came over here from Ireland with nothing, and my mother grew up one of six, and they were, my grandfather worked for the electric company, and they just got by, and my mom just never let go of that fear that we're not going to get by, that we don't have enough. And I worked my ass off. Like I've had so many, like I said, I never had a job. I never had a career job, but I used to shovel driveways and rake leaves and park cars and wash cars and babysit. I cleaned houses. I caddied. I was a parking attendant. I was a waiter. Like I bought my own boombox when I was 13 with money that I worked for. I bought my own car at 16 with the money that I worked for. When I got to college, I was able to move out and get an apartment straight out of college. And I was able to buy an apartment in New York when I was in my 20s. I was just very good about saving and having goals that I was going to spend my money on. But I think it also part of that came from a fear of not having enough. And especially once I had kids, I had sleepless nights when things were going slow. I still do. I still struggle with, am I going to be able to retire? Like, I really think I'm going to be eating cat food and living on the street. It's fucking crazy. So, I think the poverty mindset is something I'd like to get past a little more.
Yeah, and I can hear a thread of it being the driving force that made you the man that you are today and have the career that you have. Because it's like, if you just get handouts and you were given everything and you don't have any repercussions in survival mode, food, shelter, water, scarcity, all that stuff, you suffer. And you almost, like, you've seen that suffering. We've all seen the rich kid that inherits all the money and then is not driven by anything. So it's weird to try to find that balance, because I grew up poor, bought my first car at 15. I was roofing and doing the same thing in a way. And and I'm so grateful for it. But you have to go, hey, you know what? How do we find the balance of
and the crazy thing is, I didn't grow up poor. Like, we were upper middle class, but my parents didn't give me a dime, which I think is good. They made me earn my own money, which I think gave me a good work ethic. But it was just more, you just realize that you can have that mentality no matter how much money you have. You see, look at Warren Buffett. He drives a Honda and he goes to McDonald's for breakfast every morning and he flies coach. It's like, I don't admire that. I think that's pathetic.
Me too.
You worked really hard. You should enjoy your life.
Completely agree. Yeah, that's very true. I love that perspective for sure. I agree with that. Yeah. Enjoy it. But anyway, you're coming here to Phoenix November 22nd through the 24th, right?
Okay, that sounds good.
Tempe Improv. Yeah, you're like, I don't know, I'm going somewhere. Yeah. So I'm excited to see you. So for local people, that's great. Where else can people find you, where they can catch you?
Well, the special's called You Know Me, and it's on YouTube. We just hit 400,000 views, which I'm really psyched about. And, FitzDog Radio is the podcast, and Sunday Papers is the other podcast. And it's all at FitzDog.com. That's my website. You can access all that stuff. And, yeah, man, thanks so much for making the time and having me on. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. I'd love to come out to Venice and hang with you and Tom someday. Maybe we'll go talk to some weirdos and just have a good time.
That sounds great. I'd love that.
All right, brother. I appreciate you. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.